It happened not too long ago. I remember the hysteria that was developing when we first got word of what it would be. One of the largest hurricanes of all time. It wasn't developing in the southern end near Florida. In the reports leading up to it, everyone remembers recording all of the storms coming towards the northern point of the eastern coast. Some even said that New York would be many feet in water. Droves and droves of people started to move out of the Big Apple, fearing that everything they had would be lost forever. For once in my life, I was very scared for such a large amount of people who were going to feel the wrath of Mother Nature. The news called it the ending hurricane, but the World Meteorological Organization named it Hurricane John, a lousy name for such a movement. I, like so many people, reached out to family and relatives on that coast. I was ushering them to get out as soon as possible to outrun the impending doom. Many listened, but friends doing the same couldn't get their families to move or budge. I kept pushing and prodding, wondering why they would stay, but they couldn't even get an answer out of their own family. Everyone remembers watching the footage from the news of the traffic leaving the city and anywhere near it. The footage that I saw of the churning storm several hundred miles off of the coast moving forward, inching to the demise of such a historic city. Its darkness was shrouded by the speed of the winds and the water covering that hurricane, which kept it like a cloud of death. Then one day, it all stopped. Not the storm, that kept spinning and spinning, but stopped 800 miles off the coast. A bird watching its prey, not far away, but watching nonetheless, knowing it can swallow it in a second, but not quite hungry enough yet. The storms inside of the hurricane got bigger, the thunder got louder, and the lightning strikes got hotter. Meteorologists suggested that the inside of the storm was heating up to over 400 degrees due to the sheer pressure that was cooking inside and not having a chance to escape. The winds were so brutal that every opportunity these companies would try to penetrate through them was thwarted without even touching the outer rim of the hurricane. I started to think about what it would be like to find myself inside of that. Would your skin start to peel and then rip off due to the wind and heat? Maybe it would take a few seconds, maybe a minute. Either way, it wouldn't be too long. Even though the storm halted and wasn't moving toward the city again, no one was going back. People from Florida were now speaking of reports of being able to see it from the southern state, that had darkened the sky even for them. Life went on, and so did the storm. It went on and on for nearly a month, lurking in the heart of the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and America, waiting to pounce. My family in North Carolina was even starting to get worried about it. It was talked about like the first time it had ever happened, a hurricane that doesn't seem to end and doesn't seem to move. One morning, the storm was gone. Newscasts went out in helicopters to get more film of it, and it was gone. But something was in its place. I remember seeing the articles, the questions, and the theories all start to pop up. Where the storm once was, now stands a pale mountain. It was not any type of mountain, but an extremely slim one, with its width growing as it got closer to the sea, then slimming back again at the very bottom. The mountain also stood at the time, which the news thought was nearly 33,000 feet tall, casting a shadow over the world. It bolstered through the clouds, standing against the heavy waves that lapped up against its side. Looking at this thing that made no sense, defied everything that happened in this life. How did it get here? How is it formed in a storm? Was it the heat mixing with moisture? Maybe it created a sort of tectonic plate shift that happened overnight? How are there now major tsunamis or waves that rippled from beneath the sea? All of my buddies started contemplating this anomaly, and we then began to send each other links one after another. From ancient civilizations that left our planet coming back, it could be a peace offering from another galactic force that now knows about us, or a warning message from one. Some even started to think that the hell below the ocean opened up and started pushing this through. It didn't take long for the United States military to start harboring near the mountain, and several of our aircraft carriers started to sail toward it. Russia, China, and other world powers started to do the same. It was as if it were the human front to stand guard against this thing. The newscast showed these massive ships cut through the waves, making their way towards the thing, all looking like ants compared to this thing. Life started to move forward. People started to accept that this thing was here, and it was not moving, stationary as the hurricane was before it. Even though it was on the back of everyone's minds, it was best not to bring it up. It was the world's open secret, something that we couldn't run from, something that towered over us. No one knew its origin, and it could be 1,000,000 years before we found out what it was. I had called my brother. We grew estranged way back, just to hear his words on the issue. He lived a much more conservative lifestyle than I. He was a religious man. His ideas on it were not clarified, nor did they bring my more rational thinking approach to a calm. He told me that that's life. It's here and we have to deal with it. I asked about his thoughts of a higher power now, but he had no response that made me feel better. It hasn't changed. I told him thanks, hanging up on him before he could say anything. No one had an answer, and that was completely why I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think of anything else. This massive eyesore was stuck in my mind like it was stuck in the Atlantic, and no one wanted to talk about it. I couldn't sleep, I barely could eat, and I was losing myself and watching the news 24/7 trying to get answers. But the news stopped talking about it. Eyes must have left the station once they brought it up, but how? How could anyone turn off the television when that thing was staring at them from the screen? I needed an update on this thing, and I needed it at that moment. My persistent looking and digging brought me to a live stream that was watching it. Day and night, a camera was watching this thing from afar, but it was better than nothing. I needed to have power over it like it had power over me. I needed to know when it would do anything, if it would shift, if it would change, if it would start walking. I needed to be the first one to know. I would watch day and night for 3 days straight. Not an ounce of will left in my body other than to watch this thing. Watch what its next move was and how it was going to execute it. Then it happened. My red-stained eyes saw it, but barely. At this point, I must have seen double, but something was dropping off of this thing. Large rocks that were starting to fall from the top of it. It would knock down more and more. They came crashing into the ocean with splashes that jumped up into the sky. I launched out of my bed and called everyone that I knew. I told them to turn into the channel. I started to freak out. The pieces just wouldn't stop falling. The carriers even started to float away out of the fallen debris. Small chunks, big chunks, all falling over and over, as if the sky was chipping away at this anomaly. Everyone started to think about what was going to be underneath this shroud. What was inside of the rock that was starting to come out? What monstrous entity is going to crawl out of this mountain, coming out of its depths to come to end all of humanity? My glasses hung off the bridge of my nose as I was staring at these chunks landing into the abyss. I then got a text from my friend. It said, "Do you see it?" I pushed my glasses up to my face and waited for my eyes to adjust. I blinked and blinked, the fogginess starting to making out details, until I did see it. The pieces falling from the head of the mountain were by design, because what it started to look like was a face. A nose, cheekbones, and some slits for eyes in the mouth were appearing. I texted back, "Am I crazy or is that a face?" "You're not crazy. That thing has a carved face," he replied. The chunks kept falling from the height and more was being seen. It started trending. The news picked it up. The open secret of the world that everyone tried to forget about for so long was declaring all of its residents' eyes again. The show was not yet over. More and more fell, and more was detailed. The face became more feminine. The top and downward were looking more and more like a veil on her head, draping down onto her arms. Then, without any more, the pieces stopped. Her gaze fell upon the world and ours went up to her. For a moment it felt like the whole world stopped and just had to breathe a collected breath, one that we wouldn't forget. From that day forward, everything changed. I still wish that she had never come here. Whatever she was and whatever sent her to be a message of gentleness or a gift or a harbinger of evils beyond our comprehension. Many saw it as something else, because I've talked to so many people and so many of those friends and strangers have their own thoughts on this thing. What's the point? What's our purpose? Everyone had a different story or rabbit hole we went down. But one thing stayed consistent no matter what. When you looked at this entity, it always looked like it was staring right at you. Paranoia started routing and moving through the media and minor simpletons like myself. It seemed as if everyone was lost in the clutch of this being's palm, not strong enough to break through her grasp, just all of our souls trapped inside with no one to help. I started to get concerned. I started reading more and more to try to understand anything. History often repeats itself, and for once in my life, I was on my own trying to connect the dots of our past to now. But through my scrounging, I hit more dead ends than I wanted to. I got obsessed with this presence so much that I lost my job. So many people lost their jobs, but it's not a big deal. I then moved over to New York, working part-time here and there. The mass exodus caused a plummet of rent, so it wasn't hard to find a place. The streets were empty. For a town that I had never been to, all I had heard was that it was a bustling city, and the city that never sleeps. But I found that the city was quiet, soulless, and a skeleton of an old king that now lays in its final resting place. I got a spot not far off the Atlantic coast, a small apartment with one bedroom, one bathroom, and one closet, small enough for only a few jackets to fit in. It was undersized, maybe some would consider it tiny, but it was adequate. There was really one window that gazed out towards her, and through my small window I saw it well off the coast. Not particulars, but her silhouette. Today I could only see it up to her chest, and the rest were lost in the clouds, rising up and up. That week, I started to take notes on the woman. I was trying to see what it would do. Will it move one day, or will it shift just slightly, trying to figure out if we even noticed? Can she see us? What was causing it to mold into a woman? Day after day, note after note, I kept writing and writing. I had the news on behind me, while I used a newly acquired old telescope, trying to see when the next chip would happen. The news coverage started to talk about what was happening in Europe, off the western coast of England. There was a video that night of a group of maybe 200 or more people. They were all in darkened cloaks with a veil over their faces. They stood on the shore all in a line, shoulder to shoulder with one another. They all stared at the woman. The woman probably stared back. I got lost in the video. I took my eyes off her, staring at the screen. My eyes were probably reddened at this point. I watched these people all standing with the small waves washing at their feet. The man filming them is just as confused as everyone at home. They all took a step, and then another, and another. They stepped in unison all into the ocean, their wall proving stronger than the waves coming at them. They kept walking past knee-deep, then chest, then to their neck. None of them lost a step in a complete straight line until all of them converged with the water. The only thing left was the lapping waves of the ocean. And beyond that, her horrifying darkened silhouette in the distance. I could only stare, unlike the person filming whose audio was bleeped out every other word by the coverage. I waited and waited for them to rise back up, but nothing broke the surface, not even their veils. I slowly turned back towards the woman, aghast at what I had just witnessed, and noticed that more chippings were falling off of her. It took no more than 2 hours as I watched large pieces fall from the waist area, all plummeting down into the sea, followed by smaller ones as they started to show her slightly outstretched arms. Her long sleeves draped as far below as her knees. Her hands started to get defined, her fingers split in between, and her fingernails accented. She was starting to look remarkable, her face to me now taunting not a smile but a slightly unexpressed face, one that sullied all witnesses, one that immediately made me step away from my scope and turn off the news when it hit HD on my small screen. Why was this thing here? Were ancient beings watching when America received the statue from France and found it to be endearing? Was this an olive branch and they wanted one in return? What was the point? That night, I hadn't slept a wink. I lost my part-time job due to not showing up. I realized what my calling was. It was to be the ultimate witness for her, to write a book about this whole endeavor, for people 1,000 years from now to understand this situation, how it played out, and what the result was for. I understand it all now. This was my calling. That night I went for a walk to clear my head and to debrief before I went headfirst into this path. I was weighing my options and needed to get some fresh air. Madison Avenue used to be a busy street, from what I've been told, but tonight it was completely different, empty and weightless. I could scream and only hear my voice bounce off of the buildings, rising higher and higher to escape. I passed some graffiti, which must have been new and must have been quick. It was large, taking up a sizable chunk of the wall. All it read in solid red letters was, "Why did she stop looking at me?" I turned up my collar and continued walking. All I could think about was what this person meant and how they felt. Did they feel relief or grief? I wouldn't know. She still saw me. That night, I had my first episode. I fell asleep staring at her through my window. In the ease of my sleep, I found myself lost in the ocean, under the waves kicking up yet never reaching that break. I wasn't drowning yet, but I wasn't able to move up. In fact, it felt like I was getting slightly dragged down. Then all of a sudden, the waves crashing above me stopped and everything started to calm. The waters all leveled out, and I could see the night sky above. A calmness overtook me as I stopped kicking for a moment. But then the night sky was overtaken by a large grayness as she stood over me, the moon crescenting from around her head as she looked down at me. A pure horror and dread entered my soul, and for the first time I tried swimming down, but now I couldn't move at all. I turned back to her. I screamed. Her face was resting right above the water break, staring at me, her nose an inch above the sea. Her hand entered splashing mountainous waves through and through as it swung to come to get me. I woke up in a pool of sweat, clutching my shirt, which became another layer of skin in the night. Soon after, I believe that it was a Tuesday, when the first reports came in from Pakistan. A man walked into a rundown mall in the center of Islamabad in a jacket. He walked into a store, I do not recall which one, and took his jacket off. Underneath it was a vest, in his hand a remote. 13 people lost their lives that afternoon. People that knew him said he was completely enveloped by the woman and thought it was a mockery sent from hell itself. That if no one tried to shake the grasp that she had on the world, then sooner or later she would pull every last one of us back down to her resting hole. I guess his idea was to kill himself and others in a showing to maybe take eyes off of her. It didn't. Copycats and other people who were mentally unhinged started to do mass executions, people burning themselves alive, all of it caught on video and spread throughout the world on social media. One video that I saw was a man in the middle of a city, I believe Dallas. He wore a white shirt and in horrible calligraphy said, "She isn't real. None of it is." He screamed to gain more viewers, watchers, and fellow beings before he pulled a pistol out and shot himself under the jaw and through his brain. Screams followed as people ran, but he lay there, and the person filming stayed holding it on his body, his still shaking body on the concrete. He was still alive. At this time, the countries surrounding the woman with their platoons and fleets started to back away. China accused America of propaganda and conspiracized that we came up with this as a means to create a global scare. We started to say the same thing about China. The ships stopped aiming their guns at the woman and started aiming them at each other. The doomsday clock was at 11:59:59. The world was knocking on the nuclear response's door, waiting for them to answer. Germany, Poland, and Israel all started choosing sides and started demanding vocal support from other nations. Tensions were rising, and global policies were wearing thin. It was a sense of desperation that people were feeling, and you could sense it by having everyday interactions. People were starting to stock up on food, buy firearms, and even reinforce valuables. My brother started to reach out to me. I realized that I didn't think he knew that I moved. I was going to call him, but then my phone opened up to a random video. It was at this time that Mary Del Costa came onto everyone's page. If it was through different means of social media or whatever avenue you saw her. Her first video was a hit. It was a 20-second video and it was titled, "I Am Her." She was draped in a long light blue robe, her face with a slight smirk. She stood just how the woman stood. She stood like that for the whole video, a light illuminating from behind her until the video cut out. It wasn't even a few days when she posted again. What was once a video of her all alone, now she was standing in front of a congregation of 20 or more people. Same premise and the same result, but it was a little longer. The people were all on their knees in front of her, and you could see some of them there were crying, not out of a sense of fear or hurt, but a way of love and hope. I saw right through it. This horrible woman was using this life-altering event to cash in and to start a weird faux religious experience. She was all that was wrong with the world right now. I had to dedicate a whole chapter of my book to her and her alone because of what she was doing and how it was evil and lured people looking desperately for answers into her fictitious and malevolent web. All while everything was becoming crazier outside. You couldn't travel a channel or webpage without seeing the warning headlines, or a person speaking in their native tongue about the horrors that people were doing to one another. Bombings, shootings, lootings, arson, and overall anarchy became the new tenets. Neighbors become new people with the same faces. The smell of burned rubber, gas, and other aromas often crept underneath my closed windows, reminding me of the rest of the city. I didn't care for this mnemonic the city often sent me. All I know is if I was smelling it all, then I think she was too. The paper the next day read of a new disease that was spreading through many countries. It was greatly affecting only young children and the elderly. It was so early on that doctors didn't know how to describe it, how it spread, or its origins. The only thing that they could gather was that it didn't strike anywhere except brain function and the respiratory area. After visiting with some of the first couple thousand victims, it was determined that their lungs were not exchanging the proper amount of oxygen intake and carbon dioxide release, that they were holding on to their carbon dioxide. This caused them to have slight symptoms, according to people near them, of light dizziness and drowsiness. They all died in their sleep. The World Health Organization called this disease Omega-1. A meeting was to be held in Washington. The president called on many nations to attend in an attempt to try to find something to ease tensions with our rivals. Several of our allies came, and many of our biggest enemies were now in our backyard. For a little bit, many cameras turned from her and onto the gods of government as they pulled up in our United Nations building. No press was allowed into said event, and many online started to worry that this was all a scheme, a ploy. This woman planted here by all that were in charge, a way to convince people to accept a new world order, that safety was only found through strength in numbers. The meeting lasted hours. When everyone departed, all who were herded inside had faces of the lost. Reports came out of Rome and videos too. A mass movement as many Catholics gathered in and around the Vatican, all holding candles as they walked towards their Holy Land. Priests, men, women, children, a large crowd, yet all of them standing in a complete and utter silence. I wanted to call my brother to see what he thought about the whole event, but it didn't matter. I sent him a text instead, only asking, "What do you think of it all?" Very quickly, he sent me back a text telling me to pray. I never was like him. I was a scientific man, reason over faith. But to each is their own. I just stared at her body through my window. Through that window, I began noticing all of the backed-off military ships were slowly moving closer to her. While they moved closer to her, the clouds around her head started to swirl too. A storm was encroaching around her again. From my telescope, it was a beautiful sight watching the man-made machines and the weather-made spectacle all move in on her. The world was hers once again. The storm started to pick up speed, swirling and swirling. I wasn't able to see her anymore as the day started to die. The storm was perfectly encapsulating her, a cup of horror contained by her proximity. The ships all placed their bright spotlights onto the storm, helicopters and jets flying near it, tracking it for some reason. What was the point of that meeting? What was discussed? That was when the lightning started to strike in the storm. Bright lights, blue, white, and green, struck, followed quickly by the strike of thunder, barely heard by my apartment window, but must have blown the ears off of the personnel below it on those carriers. The light show went on for what seemed like hours, but could have been minutes. I never thought to check a clock or watch in case I missed something. My hand on my pencil etching words that probably made no sense while my eyes grew encrusted on the lens of my scope. The strikes became brighter, the horns became louder. That was when we saw it. Through the storm we could see her large silhouette. She seemed bigger in the shadows. More and more came. Then suddenly, they stopped for a moment. Then the brightest of them came, and I could hear the screams from across the waters. The lightning sparked the hurricane's walls with the brightest blue, yet she changed. Her arms were now completely outstretched, and her head hung to the right. I jumped back from my telescope, disoriented as my eyes tried to adjust to the change in depth. The thunder eclipsed the screams as it went dark. I could see no more. The storm raged on, but no more lightning and no more thunder. I stared in awe. I was not able to see her anymore, but the visual was everlasting in my eyes. A pic placed into my brain hidden in the wrinkles, only for me to know where it was seated. I climbed into bed, looking out to the sea, and didn't sleep awake, waiting for the storm to pass so I could see her new structure. The storm passed in the early morning when the sun crossed the horizon and was cut in half by her. Yet her stance stayed the same as before, her arms hovering off of her sides near her waist. She didn't move an inch. Was it a trick of my own eyes? What the hell had happened last night? I didn't drink more than normal. The ships were still near her. As the day brightened, I noticed the departures of several aircraft taking off of the carriers. Every single one of them sent birds up to the skies so fast that all you could catch was the exhaust trails in the air. Lost and confused, I turned on the channel, readying myself for the all-call, the horns lifted up in the air as to sound off for the fallout. But what I saw had me lost. There, on a podium outside of the White House, was the president. Well, many presidents, standing shoulder to shoulder behind ours. He was talking about the woman and how, since she has come here, no good has happened. Fear ran amok. People didn't see people, and now the Omega virus has crept into over 74 countries with countless amounts of victims. We must see this anomaly, this unprecedented and horrifying monument, as a harbinger of suffering. I stand here today aligned with many other great leaders and using our combined military strength to dispose of it quickly and efficiently, so that we can return to life again. That was when I heard the first missile hit. I spun from my television, launching myself towards my window and seeing the explosion off of her left side. Then more came. A storming of missiles and attacks from all points, earth, sea, and sky, all collectively attacking her. She stood tall, She'd stood strong. As more and more came at her, she didn't have any defense, no shield. They landed hit after hit after hit. She didn't bend or break underneath the fierce hand of man. I turned back to the news, where they were covering her sabotage. I remember that the assault lasted an hour. Punch after punch landed on her. She never showed any sign of wear or tear. When the last missile landed, it was a direct hit on her face. The tiniest crack fell down. From the base of her eye, it trickled just below her cheek. The militaries were most likely stunned, but needing to save some of their artillery, they decided that was enough for today. The attack ended at 9:54 a.m. She stood there afterwards as the air went silent throughout the world. News stations didn't know what to say. The fleet of missiles and attacks barely faced her, nearly everything that we had. It was then noticed by all eastern cities and western cities in Europe that they would be sending nuclear attacks on her in the morning. We should all leave the city at once and expect not to return until all of the fallout is cleaned up. I was never going to leave. This was my story, and I would see it through until the end. That was when she eventually would fall. I messaged my brother my thoughts and explanations as to why I came to this conclusion. He tried getting me out, he tried calling. I answered, but he offered me to stay with him so that I could get back to a normal life. He passed over how his voice sounded, his voice full of sniffles. I asked him about it. He tried turning the conversation back onto me. That is usually how we end the calls. It was not a shouting match, but a game that was at a standstill. Neither of us was going to give ground. I was staying here, you would stay there. I remember drowning all the traffic sounds throughout the day. It would be a long night, one that might even cause my death, but this project was bigger than that. I remember tuning into a live stream of Mary Del Costa. She was praying over hundreds of people now, stating that she would be leaving soon from all of them, that they should repent. I almost threw up at the psyop she was pulling. Del Costa even means off the coast. Can these people not think for themselves? They were witnessing a miracle, and instead turned towards a failed actress? It enraged me to the bone. I drank and drank. Had my alarm set up to 6 a.m. when they collectively decided to send a flurry of nukes at her. I went to bed holding back tears, thinking of what might happen to her, to me, to the world itself. All answers will be revealed in just a few hours. Time was moving ahead as it always does. Everyone held their breath to try to stop it, but to no avail. It marched. I awoke to my alarm chanting in my ear. I arose drowsy and half-blinded, my eyes recalibrated as my vision aligned to the coast. My face would have melted if I had known emotion, but at that moment I forgot everything. The horizon was connected. The sun rose with nothing to cast a shadow. The clouds floated as one, nothing to cut it in half. She was gone. No storm to announce her departure, as she so grandly did to encapsulate her arrival. Nothing. Militaries who were watching her day and night had an answer to it. She was gone and no one knew how, why, or when. Not another missile was launched. The next few days, I gathered all my thoughts, notes, photos, and everything that I had. I started to build my book. It took me a couple of months while still being cooped up in my small apartment nestled over my laptop. After I was done, it was all written up. I sent it to many publishers. Many sent it right back to me. Others took a while to get a message back. Over 30 publishers, and none of them took it. None of them wanted it. They kept telling me that it was insensitive to everyone who was lost due to the Omega virus. Nobody wanted to read about something that we all witnessed and that we all wanted to forget. That people just wanted to move on with their lives and never think of it again. I sat there, reading these messages over and over again, with a printed 400-page manuscript and nowhere to send it to. I was astounded. All my work, all my hibernation, all my purpose was to be forgotten in the wind with no one to care or want to read it. I became lost. I didn't know what to do. I started to take to the bottle more and more. Days blended into weeks, and weeks trickled and flowed to months. My brother became a victim of the virus soon after, and softly departed us. His funeral didn't have many visitors. The world, like I, had become a shell of itself. I saw it through the screen and could hear it through my window. Something felt off, like it had become darker and sadder. Even some days felt worthless. Lawlessness started growing and taking over nations. Riots ran the streets. I started to drink a lot more. I couldn't even look out the window that I grew to only know, the one where I saw her, because there was no one to look back at me. The Times Person of the Year ended up being her, with the tagline, "Why did she come? Where did she go?" There was a dedicated slot for all that was lost to the sickness, millions upon millions. Seeing her on the cover told me one thing, though, that people did care, that people wanted to read up on her, just that they didn't want to read it through me. All I could think of through this is how her leaving made me feel left behind. I always wondered who else felt the same way, but was always too afraid to ask anyone that I passed. I write this, half drunk, to whoever will read it, as a summary of what I thought my life's work was. As I sit on the floor in my closet, is to throw away on a message board to be lost as soon as others write on top of it. I sit here in silence, the door closed. With the chance she does come back, there would be no way for her to see me and what I have become.